All right, so far in this video series, what we've looked at is how to draw a demand and supply curve, how to evaluate equilibrium points, what happens when price is above equilibrium, what happens when price is below equilibrium, and we've looked at supply and demand shifts. Let's now turn our attention to the idea of consumer and producer surplus. All right, so again, I have a supply and a demand graph for us. We're going to look at quantity, our equilibrium quantity, and our equilibrium price. We want to be able to identify how well off people are doing in our marketplace. That's known as consumer surplus. Consumer surplus represents the area below the demand curve and above the price line. So I'm going to color it in, and then we'll talk about what this area means. So I'm going to tell you now that this area, this triangle, is known as consumer surplus. Imagine that you walk into the theater and you say, you know what? I'm going to purchase a soda. I'm willing and able to pay $10 for that soda. You walk in though and you notice, hey, the soda is only $5. You have a surplus from that transaction. You were willing and able to pay 10. You only had to pay 5. Everybody else that comes into the theater and purchases a soda is in the same category as you. There's some people willing to pay even more than you, maybe $15, but they only have to pay 5. There's some people only willing to pay $6, only have to pay 5. And there are some people who are willing to pay 5 and they pay 5. They have no surplus, but they're in the market. Right, so consumer surplus represents that entire area below demand and above price. Right? That's consumer surplus. We're talking about people who are consuming the goods. The alternative is true for producer surplus. Imagine that you're selling textbooks back on Amazon. You may be willing and able to sell your textbooks for a very cheap price, say $2. However, if the used market is selling your textbook for $20, you have a gain or a surplus of $18. If you're willing to sell your textbook for $10 and you get to sell it for $15, you have a surplus. If you're willing to sell it for $15 and you get to sell it for $15, you don't have a surplus, but you're getting to sell your book. There's even some people willing to give their book away for free, but they get to sell it for $15. Producer surplus is the area below price and above the supply curve, right? It represents the difference between what firms are willing to pay and what they actually receive for their product. So it represents the area that firms are willing to sell it for and how much they actually get to sell it for. These two areas together, producer surplus and consumer surplus, make up total surplus. That's the total amount of value that's in the economy because these transactions are taking place. We could evaluate a case where, and we will right now, evaluate the case where there's a price floor or a price ceiling in effect. Let's look at how that affects our producer and our consumer surplus. So we start with the same demand and supply curve that we had before. We'll look at a price ceiling being placed in effect. So again, notice that you have your equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. Traditionally, we would have this area colored in here as our consumer surplus and the lower area as our producer surplus. But in this market, we're going to place a price ceiling at P star. What that price ceiling says is you cannot sell at a price above that. So notice, as we had before, this lower area is our producer surplus. Right? We do have a few sellers who are willing to sell below that price, but they get to sell it at that new price ceiling. Where it gets tricky is looking at the demand side of it. With a price ceiling of $20, notice that firms are only willing to supply at this point of QS. Even though demand is very high, we have a shortage in place. Right? We're not selling as much as people want. The total number of goods sold in this market is limited by QS. So I'm going to draw an upwards line there to let us know we're going to stop there. Even though people are willing to purchase it, businesses are only selling that much. We can calculate consumer surplus, again, is the area below demand and above price. This QS is showing us how much is actually being purchased and how many consumers are participating in the market. There's some people willing to sell or purchase for a lot, but they get to buy it for this much lower price. So this upper area represents consumer surplus. Again, below demand, above price, but we have to stop at this vertical line because the QS is the only amount that firms are actually selling in this market. So what we've introduced by this price floor is what's known as a deadweight loss. People from society are losing. Think back to our previous example. We had, if there were no regulations in this market, we would be selling Q items. That means there are people here that are kicked out of the market. Right? We lost these people in the market. They're no longer able to participate. This area represents all of the mutually beneficial transactions that are not able to occur in this market. Right? We have people who are willing to pay a certain price, and we have firms that are willing to sell it at a higher price. All of these people in that blue area are out of the market. That's our deadweight loss. We are able to calculate this. I'll save this for a video next week, but you could calculate these points and actually calculate consumer surplus, producer surplus, and deadweight loss. But with this video, I wanted to just introduce those concepts to you. Introduce consumer surplus, introduce producer surplus, introduce deadweight loss. Price floors are typically seen as a mechanism to help consumers. And it's true, our consumer surplus is actually much larger than it was before. Just real quickly, I'll draw in where we were before in black, and you'll notice that consumers gain all of this green area, lose this upper triangle here. Right? So some consumers are definitely better off, but there's a lot more that are losing in this marketplace. So if you're looking at total surplus, notice we have this entire large triangle. We've essentially cut off a portion of that triangle, and we've lost some of it. So even though our goal was to help consumers, we may have done that, but we've hurt society as a whole. We can analyze the same piece if we looked at a price floor, where the consumer surplus is lower for some of the consumers towards the top. So again, this is just introducing the idea of consumer and producer surplus. We'll have a video later that actually calculates the size of consumer surplus and the size of producer surplus and the size of deadweight loss from a policy mechanism.